Inside Pelican Bay, America's most dangerous prison. Pelican Bay State Prison. Once thought to be a place so isolated, even the most dangerous criminals couldn't find a way to control it. But what happens when those criminals, locked away in complete isolation, form one of the most feared gangs in the country? A prison so notorious, it became the breeding ground for chaos, power struggles, and violence, all within a system built to contain the worst of the worst. This is the story of America's most dangerous maximum security prison, and the dark secrets buried within its walls. The birth of Pelican Bay, a fortress built to contain evil. In the remote corners of California's rugged coast lies a prison so notorious that even the toughest criminals quake at the thought of stepping foot inside. Pelican Bay State Prison, designed as a fortress, was meant to be the final stop for some of the country's most dangerous and violent offenders. With its high walls, tight security, and isolation units, Pelican Bay was not just a prison, it was an experiment in confinement. Opened in 1989, Pelican Bay was built to address the growing violence and gang control within the state's overcrowded prisons. Situated in Crescent City, just a few miles from the Oregon border, the prison's location was as deliberate as its design. The California Department of Corrections intended it to house the most violent, irredeemable criminals, those who had wreaked havoc in the prison system. The idea was simple: keep the worst offenders locked away from society and from each other, in conditions so harsh that escape was nearly impossible. However, this concept would soon prove to be both its strength and its flaw. The prison's isolation units, known as the Security Housing Unit, SHU, would become the epicenter of one of the most infamous gang operations in the nation. When Pelican Bay opened, it was seen as the epitome of modern corrections. The SHU, a part of the prison reserved for inmates who had been deemed too dangerous for regular housing, was equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance, razor wire, and a level of isolation that left even seasoned criminals questioning their sanity. Inmates were locked in cells for 22.5 hours a day. The remaining time was spent in a concrete yard, where they could exercise, but still, they were isolated from others. But despite the prison's high-tech security measures, there was one thing the authorities hadn't anticipated: the rise of power from within the SHU. Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison, it was a breeding ground for violence, not just among the inmates, but for the prison guards as well. Early reports from news outlets suggested that Pelican Bay quickly became a war zone, with rising tension between inmates, prison staff, and the outside world. The segregation of dangerous prisoners in isolation units seemed effective in theory, but in practice, it only intensified the anger and frustration of the incarcerated. Inmates, already hardened by their criminal backgrounds, soon realized that while they were physically isolated, they could still wield power. It was the perfect environment for gang influence to thrive. Over time, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, and other prison gangs began to establish themselves in the SHU, using their isolation to plot, organize, and control the illicit activities both within Pelican Bay and in the outside world. Many had hoped that Pelican Bay would bring peace to the state prison system. Instead, it sparked the creation of a new order, one rooted in fear, violence, and an unspoken code of power. The gangs that formed behind the walls of Pelican Bay became a dominant force, not just in California, but across the entire prison system in the United States. The question on everyone's mind was, could a system designed to contain the worst criminals become a hotbed for their expansion? As time went on, the prison's notorious reputation grew, with incidents of violence, riots, and gang conflicts regularly making headlines. Journalists, corrections officers, and former inmates began to tell tales of the shocking cruelty inside Pelican Bay, but the public remained largely unaware of the full extent of what was happening behind its walls. For the men who were locked away in its depths, Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison. It was a kingdom built on power, fear, and survival. And for some, it became their only reality. The SHU, birthplace of power and isolation. Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit, SHU, once regarded as the pinnacle of correctional containment, would soon transform into the breeding ground for one of the most tightly organized and dangerous prison gangs in history. The SHU, designed with the aim of isolating the most violent offenders, had an unintended consequence. It became a place where power was not just wielded through physical force, but through manipulation, intelligence, and control. In the SHU, isolation wasn't just about keeping prisoners apart, it was about controlling them. Each prisoner was confined to a small concrete cell, with little to no contact with the outside world. The walls were thick, the lights harsh, and the time spent alone seemed endless. Yet, for those who could survive this intense isolation, it became a proving ground for mental and emotional resilience. And among these isolated men, a new order began to emerge. The most dangerous and influential gang members quickly realized that despite their physical separation, they could still communicate. They could still organize, control, and dominate from their cells. It wasn't long before Pelican Bay's SHU became the operational hub for gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, and the Black Guerrilla family. The gangs, with their deep-rooted connections both inside and outside the prison walls, began to extend their influence. The SHU, with its harsh conditions, had inadvertently become the perfect incubator for organized crime. The most powerful figures within these gangs began to understand that even locked in solitary confinement, they could still rule. They devised clever ways to communicate, using codes, symbols, and messages hidden in letters sent to the outside world. In some cases, they used prison staff, corrupt officers who turned a blind eye, to smuggle messages between cells. In a place designed to keep prisoners isolated, the gangs had found a way to thrive. But the gang influence wasn't just limited to the inmates. The prison guards, who were tasked with maintaining order, soon found themselves caught in a game of cat and mouse. The gangs, through their control over the SHU's most dangerous inmates, began to dictate the prison's day-to-day activities. In the early days of Pelican Bay, the prison system was not prepared for the level of influence these gangs would gain. The authorities had believed that isolating the worst criminals in solitary confinement would break their spirits, but instead, it allowed them to flourish in ways never before seen in California's prison system. As the years went by, Pelican Bay's SHU became a symbol of gang power. The gangs, operating behind prison walls, were able to extend their influence far beyond the confines of Pelican Bay. Their reach spread to other California prisons, and even to the streets of Los Angeles, where the Mexican Mafia began to control drug trafficking and street-level crime. The Aryan Brotherhood's grip on white supremacy and its criminal activities also became more entrenched, influencing everything from drug deals to extortion rackets. One of the most chilling aspects of life in the SHU was the way the gangs were able to manipulate not just the inmates, but also the guards. Some corrections officers, desperate to maintain control in such a violent and volatile environment, were tempted by bribes, intimidation, and promises of protection. In a world where fear ruled, the gangs were able to exploit this vulnerability, expanding their influence beyond what the authorities had imagined. The power struggle within the SHU was relentless. The inmates fought not just for survival, but for dominance. The prison gangs, with their carefully constructed alliances, were locked in an ongoing battle for control of the SHU, fighting to maintain their positions of power and wealth. The conflicts that arose within Pelican Bay were not just about physical violence, they were about strategy, manipulation, and the complex dynamics of power. Yet, despite the incredible control these gangs had within the walls of Pelican Bay, there were still many obstacles. The constant pressure from the authorities to dismantle these gangs meant that the inmates were always on edge, always watching their backs. The smallest misstep could lead to a violent retaliation, or worse, an immediate shift in gang leadership. For the gang leaders who had managed to survive the brutal conditions of the SHU, the stakes were high. They knew that the power they held inside Pelican Bay was fragile, and they would need to rely on a network of loyal members and outside connections to protect their position. But as their influence grew, so did the risks. The world outside Pelican Bay was starting to take notice. Federal investigations were launched, aimed at dismantling the gangs that controlled the prison system. But no one knew just how deep the reach of these gangs was. The reality was that the power the gangs had built inside Pelican Bay had become an unstoppable force. Inside the concrete walls, the struggle for control of the SHU raged on. Inmates who had once been viewed as irredeemable were now seen as strategists, playing a dangerous game of manipulation, violence, and psychological warfare. And as the years passed, Pelican Bay would continue to be the epicenter of California's prison gang wars. A place where survival was not just about brute force, but about intelligence, loyalty, and the willingness to do whatever it took to stay on top. The siege of power, violence, corruption, and the SHU. Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit, SHU, was not merely a prison within a prison. It became a testing ground for the darkest elements of human nature. It was a place where power was not only maintained through violence but also through a complicated web of manipulation, loyalty, and strategic alliances. The gangs that had risen to prominence inside Pelican Bay were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for absolute control over an entire ecosystem of crime, violence, and influence. By the early 1990s, Pelican Bay had evolved into something far beyond its intended purpose. It was no longer simply a place where the most dangerous criminals were locked away. It had become a microcosm of power, a place where inmates had created their own kingdoms, each ruled by their own laws, codes, and allegiances. These were not just hardened criminals, these were men who had learned to thrive in isolation, men who had built empires without ever stepping foot outside their cells. In the SHU, where silence and isolation were supposed to break the human spirit, a strange form of order had emerged. Prison gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, and Black Guerrilla Family had become more than just groups of criminals, they had become sophisticated organizations with a global reach. Murder, extortion, and drug trafficking were merely the surface of their operations. Beneath that layer, there was an intricate system of communication, power struggles, and corruption that made Pelican Bay one of the most dangerous prisons in America. At the heart of this network was the unseen leadership of the gangs. Although many of their members were locked in solitary confinement, they still controlled the daily operations of the prison through a system of messages, codes, and, sometimes, through bribes to guards. These gang leaders, often held in the most secure cells, were the real kings of Pelican Bay, and their power reached far beyond the prison walls. But the question that plagued Pelican Bay for years was not how the gangs held power, but how they managed to maintain it. What kept the gang members so loyal, so dedicated, even in the face of extreme isolation? The answer lay in the delicate balance of violence and loyalty. In a place like Pelican Bay, where death could come at any moment, gang loyalty was the only thing that offered any semblance of protection. It wasn't just the inmates who had to fear the violence of the gangs, it was also the guards. Inmates were not the only ones who were forced to live by a brutal code. Guards who worked in Pelican Bay had to tread carefully. Many of them had been corrupted, bribed, or coerced into turning a blind eye to gang activity. Some even became active participants, smuggling in contraband, passing messages between gang leaders, or providing security during illegal operations. By the late 1990s, Pelican Bay had become a hotbed of corruption. News reports began to surface about the staggering influence of gangs within the prison, and the authorities were forced to address the issue head-on. But it was not an easy fix. The gangs were embedded so deeply into the fabric of the prison that simply locking them in isolation wasn't enough to stop their operations. To make matters worse, the guards themselves were divided. Some were loyal to the prison system, while others had fallen under the sway of the gangs. The problem was so rampant that the California Department of Corrections initiated several internal investigations to root out the corruption. But even with heightened scrutiny, the gangs remained untouchable. Their influence was so pervasive that many of the prison staff members were afraid to confront them directly. Inmates who had grown up on the streets of Los Angeles, San Francisco, and other major cities brought their gang culture with them, and that culture had taken root in the heart of Pelican Bay. The violence was relentless. Riots erupted periodically, fueled by disputes between rival gangs, or sometimes simply because one inmate had crossed another. The most violent outbreaks were often tied to the complicated social dynamics within the SHU. For example, if a gang leader's order was not followed, the consequences were severe. An inmate might disappear into the shadows, only to be found days later, his body hidden in the depths of the prison. But the most dangerous aspect of Pelican Bay's gang operations wasn't just the violence, it was the fear. Fear was the glue that held everything together. Fear of death, fear of retribution, fear of being betrayed. It was this fear that forced the inmates to follow their leaders and keep their allegiances intact, even when faced with horrific conditions. For the inmates, every action was calculated. Whether it was a move in the underground drug trade, a gang-related murder, or a retaliatory strike against a rival gang, each decision was made with the full knowledge that it could mean life or death. But in the world of Pelican Bay, where violence was as much a part of daily life as breathing, death was often the only escape. It was in the early 2000s that Pelican Bay would face its greatest challenge, the growing pressure from the outside world to reform its prison system. Activists and human rights organizations began to shine a spotlight on the conditions within the SHU, arguing that the harsh isolation imposed on inmates amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. The California prison system, already struggling with overcrowding, was under intense scrutiny, and the public outcry over Pelican Bay's practices became too loud to ignore. Pelican Bay had become a symbol, not just of violence and gang control, but of the failures of the correctional system. As the debate over prison reform gained momentum, Pelican Bay remained a powerful reminder of the harsh realities of American prisons, where gangs, violence, and corruption held the reins. But within the walls of Pelican Bay, life went on. The gangs continued to control, the guards continued to struggle, and the system continued to be tested by the ever-looming threat of violence. The question remained, could this cycle of power, fear, and violence ever truly be broken? The global reach, Pelican Bay's influence beyond the walls. The story of Pelican Bay State Prison wasn't confined to its high walls or the isolation of the Security Housing Unit, SHU. What happened inside the prison didn't stay inside. Over the years, Pelican Bay's influence would reach far beyond the prison gates, extending its grip to the streets of California and even the nation. The gangs inside Pelican Bay, the Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, Black Guerrilla Family, and others, had become powerful enough to control illicit operations from the inside, bending the outside world to their will. While Pelican Bay's primary function was to isolate and control the most dangerous inmates, its reputation as a gang stronghold quickly became known nationwide. The very name Pelican Bay was synonymous with violence, power, and corruption. Prison gangs had carved out territories not just within the prison, but also on the streets of Los Angeles, San Francisco, and other urban centers, extending their influence far beyond the concrete walls that surrounded them. In the early 2000s, law enforcement agencies began to see a disturbing trend. The gangs that originated within Pelican Bay were beginning to assert control over the drug trade, weapon trafficking, and human trafficking across California. It was as though Pelican Bay's gang leaders were running operations as efficiently as any well-organized crime syndicate. Drug cartels, especially those controlled by the Mexican Mafia, became a focal point in Pelican Bay's vast network. While many believed that the prison system could contain the operations of these gangs, Pelican Bay proved that the reach of criminal organizations, once formed behind bars, could not be confined to a prison yard. The Mexican Mafia, one of the most influential and feared prison gangs in the U.S., had ties that ran deep in the state's prison system, and Pelican Bay's SHU was a critical hub. Gang leaders would give orders to their operatives on the outside using coded letters, hidden messages, and intermediary guards willing to smuggle information out. In many cases, Pelican Bay inmates directed the drug operations, which funded their criminal empire both inside and outside the prison. By the time the early 2000s arrived, Pelican Bay had cemented its reputation as a gang center, and its influence extended far into California's prison system. As gang leaders rose in power inside the SHU, their followers on the streets became just as dangerous. Drug cartels, already thriving in Mexican border states, saw Pelican Bay as an opportunity to expand into new markets. These connections meant that criminal networks extended into the heart of the U.S. drug trade, bringing the world of gang violence and drug trafficking directly into neighborhoods across California. But Pelican Bay wasn't just central to the Mexican Mafia. Other gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood used their time in the SHU to manipulate and control white supremacist movements both inside the prison system and on the streets. Inmates who served time in Pelican Bay's SHU would often be released back into society as formidable leaders, guiding their followers in ongoing drug and extortion rackets, while ensuring their gangs' control over California's criminal activities. As Pelican Bay's influence grew, so did the corruption within the prison system. Investigations started to show that Pelican Bay inmates were in constant contact with the outside world, despite their isolation, through corrupt officers, smuggled phones, and complicit prison staff. These revelations shocked the public. It was clear that the prison staff responsible for keeping Pelican Bay's most dangerous inmates under control were themselves often at the mercy of the gangs. The unseen world of prison gangs and corruption. The gang leaders operating from within the SHU knew how to play the game. They weren't just surviving, they were strategizing. Using their well-established criminal enterprises, the leaders were able to manipulate the system. They had no direct access to the outside world, but they had learned to exploit every loophole and weakness in the prison system. Over time, it became clear that Pelican Bay's gang leaders were running their organizations with a level of sophistication that the state couldn't contain. Prison gangs became multi-million-dollar operations, leveraging their hold on California's prison system to extend control over other illegal activities, from drug smuggling to protection rackets. According to several reports, Pelican Bay was a key player in the vast network of organized crime that fueled California's drug epidemic in the 1990s and early 2000s. Inmates were able to send coded messages to their operatives on the outside, ensuring the smooth flow of contraband, weapons, and money into and out of the prison. Some of the most high-profile cases involved the smuggling of cell phones into the prison, despite efforts to prevent communication. In 2009, a major scandal broke when it was discovered that prison guards were involved in smuggling cell phones into Pelican Bay, further solidifying the gang's influence inside and out. The most dangerous part of this system was how easily Pelican Bay inmates could continue to coordinate criminal activity, even though they were kept in solitary confinement. This was a key turning point for the prison system. Pelican Bay had proved that a well-organized criminal operation could not just survive in isolation, it could thrive and expand into an underground empire that reached across California, infecting the very heart of the state's criminal justice system. The complex network of corruption within the prison became even more apparent when inmates with ties to the gangs were released back into society. They brought with them the skills, connections, and knowledge needed to run the same types of criminal enterprises on the streets that they had operated in prison. The prison-to-street pipeline had become a dangerous reality. Even though Pelican Bay's SHU was meant to isolate and break the spirit of the inmates, it had done the opposite. It had created feared, intelligent gang leaders who were better organized than ever. What was meant to be a confining measure had turned into a fortress of power, with inmates running the show both inside the walls and beyond. Pelican Bay's connection to the outside world was becoming more well-known as federal investigations started to dig deeper. The gangs weren't just operating in the shadows anymore. They were running the entire criminal operation, with Pelican Bay serving as their command center. The prison riot, breaking point. By the mid-2000s, Pelican Bay had become the epicenter of California's prison system, not just in terms of its high-profile inmates but also in the constant friction between the gangs and the system that was desperately trying to keep them under control. Despite the efforts of prison officials, Pelican Bay's reputation for violence, corruption, and gang control had reached a tipping point. The pressure within Pelican Bay's walls had been mounting for years. The gangs had grown in power, the isolation and violence inside the SHU were taking a toll, and tensions between inmates and guards had reached a fever pitch. It wasn't just the inmates who were at risk, it was the very structure of the California Department of Corrections that was under attack. In 2006, the boiling tension finally erupted in what would become one of the most infamous riots in the prison's history. The riot wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a carefully orchestrated attack, one that had been building for years as gang leaders inside Pelican Bay strategically planned their moves, waiting for the right moment to strike. What began as a small skirmish in the yard quickly escalated into a full-scale riot, with inmates overpowering guards and fellow prisoners alike. The riot was so intense that it involved multiple gangs, each trying to assert dominance over the others. The Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, and Black Guerrilla Family all played a role in the violence, which spread through the prison like wildfire. What made the riot even more dangerous was the fact that it wasn't just about territorial control inside the prison. The gangs were testing their ability to assert dominance in a place designed to break them. The prison guards, already outnumbered and overwhelmed, found themselves caught in a battle they were not prepared for. Inmates armed with shanks, homemade weapons, and even smuggled guns wreaked havoc across the facility. The authorities were caught off guard. They had underestimated the unity and discipline of the gangs that had formed within Pelican Bay. As the chaos unfolded, inmates flooded the yard, each fighting to claim their territory, and prison staff struggled to maintain any sense of order. The sound of screaming, the clashing of metal, and the pounding of feet on concrete reverberated through the prison halls. Officers were trapped in their posts, unable to regain control of the facility. Inmates began to take control of the prison's most critical points, including the control centers and armories. The authorities had to call in reinforcements. SWAT teams from the California Highway Patrol and the National Guard were dispatched to Pelican Bay to help quell the violence. The sight of armed officers swarming the prison's yard was a chilling reminder of how out of control Pelican Bay had become. The chaos lasted for several days before the riot was finally brought under control, but the damage had already been done. Pelican Bay's reputation, already notorious for housing the state's most dangerous criminals, had now become synonymous with one of the most violent uprisings in the U.S. prison system. The aftermath, control and consequences. After the riot, the California Department of Corrections was forced to take a hard look at Pelican Bay. The prison's management, once confident in its ability to contain the most dangerous criminals in the state, was now facing a reality check. The gang influence had spread far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The inmates had proved that they were not just surviving in isolation, they were thriving. In the aftermath of the riot, the prison faced intense scrutiny from prison reform advocates, legal organizations, and the public. The brutal conditions in Pelican Bay's SHU were called into question once again. The 24-hour lockdown, the lack of educational programs, and the isolation of inmates for years on end had only fueled the prison's gang culture. Pelican Bay was a pressure cooker, and the inmates were the ones who had learned to navigate its harsh environment to gain power. For many, the riot was a wake-up call, a stark reminder of how dangerous it was to ignore the deep-rooted gang affiliations inside the prison system. The violence had proven that the gangs were not just inside the prison, they had taken hold of the entire system. Following the riot, the state was forced to make changes, but it was clear that the damage was done. The gangs had shown that they could wield power even in the most controlled environment. And for the prison system, the consequences were far-reaching. Pelican Bay's long-standing isolation policies were under fire, with many human rights groups arguing that such conditions were inhumane and only contributed to the rise of gang influence. Critics argued that Pelican Bay, rather than breaking the spirit of its inmates, had created a breeding ground for violence, and that the lack of rehabilitation programs and mental health support had contributed to the breakdown of order. As investigations into the riot continued, prison officials tried to clean up the mess left behind. They implemented more stringent security measures and increased surveillance in the SHU. Yet, despite these efforts, Pelican Bay had already become a symbol of what happens when gangs are allowed to flourish unchecked within the prison system. The riot in 2006 marked a turning point for Pelican Bay. It would never again be just a prison. It had become a flashpoint in the debate over America's prison system, gang control, and the question of how to reform a system that was, for all its high-tech security, still deeply flawed. The fight for reform, Pelican Bay under fire. The 2006 riot at Pelican Bay had left a mark so deep that it was impossible for the state of California to ignore. For decades, Pelican Bay State Prison had been the dark heart of California's prison system, a place where the most dangerous criminals were isolated in an attempt to curb their influence. But the riot had proven that isolation alone would never work. The gangs had not only survived in the SHU, they had thrived, becoming more powerful and organized than ever before. Now, the prison system had to deal with the fallout of its failure. As the dust settled from the violent uprising, Pelican Bay found itself at the center of a storm. Public opinion was turning sharply against the prison's methods. Human rights groups, journalists, and prison reform advocates had long condemned the extreme isolation used in the SHU, but now, the world was paying attention. The public could no longer ignore the inhumane conditions in Pelican Bay, and officials had no choice but to confront the issue head-on. The events at Pelican Bay were the catalyst for a massive push for reform in California's prison system. For years, the state had been under fire for its overcrowded prisons, lack of rehabilitation programs, and high rates of recidivism. Now, Pelican Bay was the focal point of a national conversation on the future of prisons in the United States. The SHU, once a symbol of security, had become a symbol of failure. The California Department of Corrections had long defended its use of solitary confinement as a necessary tool to control dangerous prisoners. But after the 2006 riot, the narrative began to shift. Pelican Bay's lockdown strategy, once seen as an efficient way to control gangs and violent offenders, was now being seen as a breeding ground for violence, a place where isolation wasn't just a punishment, but a catalyst for gang proliferation. The problem was multifaceted. It wasn't just the physical violence of the prison riot that demanded attention. The real issue was the psychological toll of prolonged isolation. Inmates in the SHU were subjected to over 2 decades of complete social isolation. They were locked in small concrete cells for 23 hours a day, allowed only 1 hour for exercise, and had little to no human contact. Experts in mental health began to speak out, highlighting the severe impact of such isolation on the human mind. Research showed that prolonged solitary confinement could lead to severe psychological damage, including depression, hallucinations, and even suicidal tendencies. The world began to look at Pelican Bay not as a model of prison security, but as a flawed experiment. By keeping prisoners in isolation for decades, the state was essentially creating monsters, men who had been broken, not rehabilitated. The gangs inside the SHU were not only surviving but growing stronger, their control over the prison system extending beyond Pelican Bay and into other facilities across California. The public outcry was undeniable. In 2011, a federal court ruling found that the conditions inside Pelican Bay's SHU violated the Eighth Amendment, which protects against cruel and unusual punishment. The ruling was a direct response to the ongoing solitary confinement practices and the profound mental health consequences for inmates. The court order demanded changes to Pelican Bay, calling for a reduction in the number of inmates in isolation and an end to the extreme conditions that had created such an oppressive environment. This ruling sent a shockwave through the California prison system. Pelican Bay was no longer seen as a model of correctional success but a glaring example of everything that was wrong with the country's prison system. For many, this was the beginning of a long-overdue reckoning. Prison reform advocates and human rights groups began to demand broader changes. The California Department of Corrections, facing public pressure, was forced to respond. In 2012, the state announced plans to overhaul Pelican Bay's SHU and gradually reduce the number of inmates held in solitary confinement. Yet, the reforms were far from perfect. The state began moving inmates out of solitary confinement, but the gangs within Pelican Bay didn't disappear. Instead, they adapted. The gangs that had thrived in isolation now found new ways to operate, moving from the SHU into general population units. They had become too powerful, too entrenched, to simply fade away. The shifting power dynamics, gangs moving in and out of isolation. As the pressure on Pelican Bay's SHU grew, prison officials began to implement new measures designed to disrupt gang control. For the first time in decades, Pelican Bay's leadership tried to segregate gang members from the general population to prevent them from coordinating criminal activity. But the gangs, led by figures who had spent decades in isolation, proved to be incredibly resourceful. Gang leaders who had spent years in solitary confinement were suddenly being integrated back into the general population. Some of them had been in total isolation for over 20 years, yet they quickly reasserted their dominance. They organized their followers, continuing their criminal operations both inside and outside the prison system. Inmates who had once been seen as isolated and helpless now had the power to control entire parts of the prison. This shift in power dynamics left Pelican Bay's correctional officers and administrators scrambling to adapt. Despite the changes in policy, the gangs maintained a level of influence that many felt was untouchable. The reality was clear: Pelican Bay had become the epicenter of California's prison gang system. No matter how many reforms were implemented, the gangs still held a significant amount of control. Pelican Bay's story was no longer just about prison reform. It was about power, control, and the consequences of a system that had let gangs grow and thrive behind bars. The most dangerous criminals in the United States had found a way to manipulate the system, and even with the best efforts at reform, they remained a force to be reckoned with. The end of an era. By the mid-2010s, Pelican Bay's SHU had undergone a significant transformation, but it was still far from perfect. The prison was no longer the same fortress of isolation it once was, but the gangs that had risen to power inside had adapted. The true test for Pelican Bay, and for California's entire prison system, would be whether they could break the cycle of violence and gang control that had dominated for so long. As the years went by, Pelican Bay would remain a focal point in the debate over solitary confinement, gang violence, and the future of the U.S. prison system. The prison had shown that even the most isolated criminals could find ways to organize, control, and survive. But it had also shown that prison reform was not as simple as opening new doors. The gangs inside Pelican Bay had grown too powerful, too connected to be easily dismantled. Pelican Bay's legacy would forever be linked to the issue of prison reform. It was a reminder that no matter how harsh the conditions, the human will to survive and the thirst for power would always find a way. The endgame: Pelican Bay's legacy and the fight for reform. As the years passed, the legacy of Pelican Bay State Prison remained a powerful symbol of everything that was wrong with America's prison system. The violent uprisings, the gang influence, and the corruption inside the prison had exposed the deep flaws of a system that was supposed to keep society safe. But instead, Pelican Bay had become a microcosm of everything that was failing in the United States' approach to criminal justice. In the wake of the 2006 riot, the California Department of Corrections had promised to reform the prison. Public outcry had led to legal battles, investigations, and changes in policy. But as Pelican Bay entered its third decade, it was clear that reform was no easy feat. The gangs that had taken root in the prison were not just a temporary problem, they were a systemic issue, and they weren't going away without a fight. The changes to Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit, SHU, were significant, but they were not the complete answer. Inmates who had once been isolated for decades were now being integrated back into the general population, where gangs quickly reasserted control. Pelican Bay had become a battlefield, not just between inmates and guards, but between the forces of reform and the entrenched power of the prison gangs. For many, Pelican Bay's saga raised an uncomfortable question: was it possible to reform a system that had become so deeply entrenched in violence, corruption, and gang control? Could a prison that had nurtured these criminal organizations for decades be reformed without risking the very fabric of California's entire correctional system? The prison system, already burdened by overcrowding and underfunded resources, was now facing a growing prison reform movement. Advocates argued that solitary confinement had to be abolished, and the SHU was a direct violation of human rights. The psychological toll of years in isolation had led to a mentally broken generation of inmates, many of whom were so deeply entrenched in gang culture that they had become functionally untouchable. Yet, despite the growing call for reform, Pelican Bay was a fortress that refused to fall. The gangs inside had adapted, growing more sophisticated, more strategic. They had learned to manipulate the system, using their newfound integration into the general population to further expand their criminal empires. The Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, and other gangs continued to wield power both inside the prison and on the streets. Federal and state lawmakers began to argue that the real solution lay not in reforming Pelican Bay, but in fundamentally overhauling the entire prison system. The mass incarceration crisis in the United States had reached its boiling point, and Pelican Bay was just one small piece of the puzzle. Many believe that the prison industrial complex itself was the root cause of the violence and gang control inside Pelican Bay. The issue wasn't just about one prison, it was about a system that had been broken for decades. In 2013, the California State Assembly voted to reduce the use of solitary confinement statewide, citing studies that showed how isolation could lead to long-term psychological harm. Pelican Bay, which had once been seen as the crown jewel of California's tough-on-crime approach, was now being forced to reckon with its own failures. But while Pelican Bay's role in the national prison reform movement grew more prominent, its impact on California's street gangs remained undeniable. The prison's gang culture had spilled over into communities across the state. Inmates who had been released from Pelican Bay often brought their criminal knowledge, connections, and street power with them, causing an uptick in organized crime on the streets of Los Angeles, San Francisco, and beyond. One of the most devastating impacts of Pelican Bay's continued gang presence was on California's youth. Teenagers who had been involved in gangs on the streets of Los Angeles, Fresno, or Oakland found themselves being drawn into the prison system at younger ages. Once inside, they were introduced to the brutal world of prison gangs, often with devastating consequences. The gangs didn't just operate in Pelican Bay. They recruited new members from the streets, turning young people into lifetime criminals before they even had a chance to leave the system. Pelican Bay's legacy had become a symbol of the cyclical nature of prison gangs. Inmates who spent decades behind bars weren't just serving time, they were building networks, creating alliances, and maintaining power from within the prison. By the time they were released, they were often more dangerous than when they entered. Even as California prison reform efforts continued, many saw Pelican Bay as a stark reminder that real change in the system would require much more than just a few policy changes. It would take a fundamental shift in how the country approached punishment, rehabilitation, and crime. As Pelican Bay continued to house the most dangerous criminals in the United States, the question remained, could the cycle of gang violence and corruption ever truly be broken? Or had Pelican Bay become so entrenched in its violent culture that it was beyond redemption? For those who lived and died within its walls, Pelican Bay was more than just a prison. It was a kingdom of control, a place where power was bought and sold, where violence was a currency, and where loyalty was the only currency that mattered. The future of Pelican Bay, a turning point or a lost cause? As Pelican Bay State Prison entered the 2020s, the question that had haunted the prison for decades seemed more urgent than ever: could the system be reformed, or was Pelican Bay destined to remain a symbol of everything wrong with the American prison system? The debates about solitary confinement, prison overcrowding, and gang control had taken center stage, and the attention Pelican Bay received in the media and from prison reform advocates showed no signs of waning. For years, Pelican Bay had been at the forefront of discussions about the future of prison in America. The prison's harsh conditions and its unprecedented levels of gang violence had made it a lightning rod for controversy. But now, as public opinion began to shift toward a broader conversation about criminal justice reform, Pelican Bay was forced to confront not just its own legacy, but the larger issues at the heart of America's prison system. Pelican Bay had become a symbol of failed policies, a symbol of excessive punishment, and a symbol of the human cost of a system designed to lock people away, often without hope of rehabilitation. And while the prison had tried to adapt, it was clear that reform was more difficult than anyone had imagined. Pelican Bay was no longer just a place where the worst criminals were held, it was a microcosm of the broader failures of America's prison system. Shifting public opinion and legal battles. The early 2020s saw a groundswell of prison reform activists calling for an end to the harsh practices that had defined Pelican Bay for decades. As more reports came out about the mental health effects of solitary confinement, particularly in the SHU, the pressure on the state government to change its approach grew. Advocacy groups like the American Civil Liberties Union (ACLU) and Prison Fellowship had long pushed for a reduction in solitary confinement, and now, they were using Pelican Bay as the focal point of their campaigns. The turning point came in 2021, when a landmark ruling in federal court reaffirmed the inhumane conditions inside Pelican Bay's SHU, especially for those who had spent decades in isolation. The ruling sparked a new round of protests, legal battles, and calls for drastic changes to California's prison system. Inmates held in the SHU were still subjected to harsh conditions, with little to no interaction with others, and many of them were now at risk of permanent psychological damage. The ruling called for Pelican Bay to reduce the number of inmates in solitary confinement and to find alternative methods of managing high-risk offenders. For many, this legal victory was a long-awaited victory, a sign that the efforts to reform Pelican Bay might finally have a chance. But for others, the fight was far from over. The reforms that had been ordered were slow to be implemented, and Pelican Bay's status as the most dangerous prison in California made it a tough case to crack. The gangs, a persistent force. While the state's efforts to reform Pelican Bay's solitary confinement policies were met with some success, there was one issue that still loomed large: the power of the gangs. Pelican Bay had become the epicenter of gang violence, and despite efforts to dismantle the criminal organizations operating within its walls, the gangs were as strong as ever. The Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, and Black Guerrilla Family were not just surviving, they were thriving. Despite the prison system's best efforts to isolate gang members and reduce their influence, the gangs continued to exert significant power both inside and outside the prison. They had deep connections with street-level gangs in California and across the country, making them formidable opponents in any attempt to regain control of the prison system. The fact that Pelican Bay's most dangerous inmates were still in control of the prison, even after decades of reform efforts, revealed a deeply troubling reality: gangs had become so deeply entrenched in the prison system that reform was nearly impossible without dismantling the entire network. These criminal organizations had outlasted any efforts to break them down. Pelican Bay's leadership continued to face a delicate balancing act. They had to deal with the everyday violence and criminal activity of the gangs while trying to implement reforms aimed at improving conditions. The gangs, meanwhile, had adjusted to the changes, continuing their illicit operations both inside and outside the prison, often using sophisticated tactics to bypass the efforts of law enforcement. In 2022, a surprise discovery rocked the prison. An investigation uncovered a smuggling ring operating within Pelican Bay's walls, involving inmates, guards, and even officials from outside the prison system. The gang leaders, still locked away in solitary confinement, were pulling the strings of the operation from their isolated cells. Smuggled cell phones, drugs, and weapons were finding their way into the prison with the help of corrupt staff members. It was a chilling reminder that, despite everything, the gangs were still very much in control. The push for alternatives to incarceration. While Pelican Bay was grappling with the reality of gang control and overcrowding, a new and more radical solution to prison reform was emerging in the United States. The growing movement to end mass incarceration and find alternatives to prison had gained significant momentum, and Pelican Bay was again at the forefront of the debate. Criminal justice reform advocates began to push for a system that didn't rely on locking people away for decades at a time. They called for a shift away from punitive justice and toward a system that focused on rehabilitation. The argument was that Pelican Bay and other prisons like it had failed to reform criminals and had instead created a system that reinforced violence, gang control, and criminal behavior. Advocates for alternatives to incarceration argued that rather than continuing to punish inmates by isolating them in places like Pelican Bay, the focus should shift to treatment and rehabilitation. Mental health services, education programs, and re-entry programs were seen as the key to breaking the cycle of crime. For Pelican Bay's inmates, many of whom had spent decades in solitary confinement, such programs could provide a path to reintegration into society, rather than condemning them to a life of violence and isolation. The future of Pelican Bay. As of the mid-2020s, Pelican Bay stood at a crossroads. It was a prison still deeply embedded in the dark underbelly of America's criminal justice system, but it was also a prison caught in the middle of an ongoing reform movement. Would the California prison system be able to tear down the walls of corruption, gang control, and isolation that had defined Pelican Bay for so long? Or had Pelican Bay become so entrenched in its ways that true reform was impossible? One thing was clear: the story of Pelican Bay wasn't over. It was a legacy of failure, yes, but it was also a symbol of a system that was now struggling to find a way forward. Whether Pelican Bay could ever become a model for true corrections reform or remain a symbol of everything wrong with American prisons was still yet to be seen. The fight for prison reform, especially in places like Pelican Bay, had become a fight for the future of the criminal justice system. Pelican Bay's story had gone from being a warning of how dangerous gang culture could become in prison to a battlefield for the soul of America's prison system. It was a fight that was far from over, and the ultimate winner remained to be seen. The ripple effect, Pelican Bay's lasting impact on California's prison system. Pelican Bay's legacy is one that extends far beyond the concrete walls of its solitary confinement units or the infamous gang activity that has plagued its corridors for decades. As the prison becomes more synonymous with gang control, human rights violations, and failed correctional strategies, it serves as a critical reflection of the wider systemic issues plaguing America's prison system. While the California Department of Corrections and the public debate over prison reform have pushed for change, the shadow of Pelican Bay remains long, casting doubt on whether real reform can ever be achieved in the system. For the inmates who have cycled through Pelican Bay, their stories often don't end when they are released back into society. The cycle of recidivism and gang loyalty follows them, influencing not just their own futures but the futures of their communities. The prison system, and Pelican Bay specifically, has become a crucible in which lives are often ruined beyond repair. The long-term impacts of solitary confinement, gang affiliation, and the lack of proper rehabilitation programs can make it nearly impossible for former inmates to reintegrate into society successfully. As Pelican Bay continues to house California's most dangerous criminals, the broader effects of its policies and the gang's reach are becoming more apparent in communities across the state. In fact, some argue that the prison system has created a self-perpetuating system of violence, where prison gangs not only rule the prison system but also the streets of major cities. This chapter will examine the broader, lasting impacts Pelican Bay has had on the state and the country at large. The ripple effect on the streets, how Pelican Bay fueled gang expansion. One of the most troubling aspects of Pelican Bay's rise to infamy is the way its influence extended far beyond the prison gates. Inmates, many of whom spent years in the SHU, didn't just serve their time and fade away. Instead, their gang affiliations and criminal knowledge followed them, creating a back-and-forth pipeline of crime between the prison and the streets. Gangs like the Mexican Mafia and the Aryan Brotherhood didn't just exist behind bars, they had deep roots in California's gang landscape. These organizations, often started and nurtured in places like Pelican Bay, had a massive impact on California's drug trade, human trafficking, and gang warfare in cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Oakland. The truth is that Pelican Bay wasn't just housing dangerous criminals, it was shaping the future of organized crime in the state. Gang leaders inside Pelican Bay, despite being in solitary confinement, were still able to control drug trafficking, street violence, and other illegal activities. As former inmates were released from the prison, they were often tasked with continuing the operations they had overseen inside, using their street connections to keep the criminal organizations alive. This prison-to-street pipeline was more than just a simple exchange of information, it was a system of criminal influence that allowed the gangs to flourish on the outside. Former inmates, now out of prison, often found it easier to reintegrate into criminal life than to find a way to return to normal society. Many were unable to escape the web of gang influence that had taken root in their lives, both in prison and in their communities. The end result was a self-sustaining criminal network that thrived in California's underbelly. The violence inside Pelican Bay created a violent culture that extended outward, where gang leaders called the shots from their isolated cells, their influence felt in the streets as much as it was in the prison yard. As a result, California's gang violence surged in the years following the prison's establishment. The effect on California's overcrowded prison system. Pelican Bay, with its extreme isolation and harsh conditions, didn't just affect its immediate inmates. It had a profound impact on California's entire prison system. Overcrowding in California prisons, already a critical issue by the late 1990s, became exacerbated by Pelican Bay's expansion and the mass influx of gang members into the SHU. The state's approach to solitary confinement was seen as a solution to control the gangs, but it became a problem in itself. As Pelican Bay's SHU grew to house more and more inmates, many were held for indefinite periods, exacerbating the state's overcrowded prisons. Inmates who spent decades locked away in isolation grew more volatile, leading to even greater violence and unrest in the system. This massive overcrowding, coupled with the inability to effectively manage the growing influence of gangs like the Mexican Mafia, created a crisis. Pelican Bay's influence on California prisons became so overwhelming that even after the court orders for reform in the 2010s, the state had trouble clearing the backlog of prisoners who had been held in isolation for far too long. By the early 2020s, California's prison system was severely taxed, and Pelican Bay had become the symbol of its flaws. For many, prison reform was not just a matter of improving conditions for inmates. It was a matter of creating a new approach to criminal justice, one that focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment. But Pelican Bay, with its history of violence and gang control, was standing in the way of that vision. Could the state even begin to address the overcrowding crisis if it didn't first dismantle the influence of Pelican Bay's gangs? The nationwide impact, how Pelican Bay became a warning. Pelican Bay's reach wasn't just limited to California. As word of its brutality and gang control spread, other states began to pay attention. Federal investigations into Pelican Bay's activities exposed the deep connections between prison gangs and street gangs across the U.S. The Mexican Mafia, for example, wasn't just operating in California, it had expanded its influence into Arizona, Texas, and even parts of Mexico. Pelican Bay's story served as a warning for the rest of the country. If prison systems like California's continued to operate in isolation, it wouldn't just be the inmates who suffered. The criminal organizations they housed would continue to spread their reach, infecting the streets and towns of America. Pelican Bay's legacy had become a national conversation on how to reform prisons, focusing on the need for alternatives to solitary confinement, a reduction in overcrowding, and better support for mental health. But despite these conversations, Pelican Bay's influence could still be felt, even as the world demanded reform. The future of Pelican Bay, a reform or a continued cycle? As of the 2020s, Pelican Bay is still one of the most heavily scrutinized prisons in America. The push for reform has continued, with a focus on limiting solitary confinement, improving conditions in the SHU, and addressing the root causes of gang violence. But the road to reform remains long, and Pelican Bay's gangs have adapted to every change thrown their way. Pelican Bay's story is far from over. While the state of California may continue to make strides in reform, the influence of the gangs, the psychological toll of isolation, and the sheer power of the system that has been built within the prison's walls will continue to shape its future for years to come. Pelican Bay's history is a tragic reflection of what happens when prisons become not places of rehabilitation, but places of perpetual violence, corruption, and gang control. The fight for reform is far from over, and Pelican Bay will remain at the heart of that battle, a constant reminder that the prison system must change, not just for those incarcerated but for the safety and well-being of the society that houses them. As we've seen throughout this journey, Pelican Bay isn't just a prison, it's a symbol. A symbol of everything that has gone wrong with America's approach to criminal justice. What began as an experiment in isolation and control has become a breeding ground for violence, gang power, and corruption, not just inside the prison, but on the streets of California and beyond. For decades, Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit, SHU, stood as a fortress meant to isolate and break the spirit of the most dangerous criminals. But in the process, it created something far darker, a place where gang leaders were able to thrive, where human rights violations became routine, and where the power of gangs reached far beyond the prison walls. Despite the legal battles, prison reform efforts, and public outcry, Pelican Bay remains a testament to the failures of a system built on punishment rather than rehabilitation. Inmates who served time here didn't just pay for their crimes, they were shaped by a system that turned isolation into a tool of control. For some, Pelican Bay wasn't a place to reflect on their actions, it was a place to harness power and continue their criminal enterprises both inside and outside. But the story of Pelican Bay isn't over. As the nation grapples with prison reform, mental health issues, and gang control, Pelican Bay continues to stand as a warning, that a system built on isolation, violence, and neglect can only create more violence and corruption. Pelican Bay's legacy will be felt for years to come, not just in California, but in every corner of America's prison system. As we look toward the future, one thing is clear: true reform won't come until we confront the deep-rooted issues that keep men like those in Pelican Bay locked in a cycle of violence and isolation. Thank you for joining us on this journey inside one of the most notorious prisons in the United States. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories from the darkest corners of America's criminal justice system. Stay tuned for our next documentary as we continue to dive deep into the true stories that haunt our prisons and our society.